If you are one of the millions who's visited the Victoria and Albert Museum in London or the British Museum, you've seen artifacts from around the world. But it might surprise you to find out that not all of those artifacts are, strictly speaking, real. In the case of the cast courts of the Victoria and Albert Museum, none of the artifacts actually came from exotic locations. From Michelangelo's David to Trajan's Column, what they are is plaster casts of some of the world's most famous works of art. It represents an interesting time in history and a laudable moment of international cooperation that deserves to be remembered. Casting important works of art in plaster to make copies goes back to antiquity. The ancient Romans, who admired Greek sculpture, made molds of the Greek originals and produced plaster copies, which could be used to make marble or bronze replicas that could be kept in Italy. Demand for these kinds of copies grew to enormous levels by the 2nd century AD, filling wealthy Roman homes and the niches of public monuments and theaters. Plaster casts have also been traditionally used for studies, artistic practice, and education. Among the earliest collections of casts for the sake of displaying copies was assembled in the 1500s by Leon Leoni, assembled in his house in Milan in his effort to collect as many of the most celebrated works, carved and cast, antique and modern, as he was able to obtain. In 1540, King Francis of France ordered casts of famous statues from Rome, and King Philip IV of Spain did the same in 1650. Large collections, however, didn't really begin to become common before the 18th century. In 1662, a set of casts from molds that were made for the French Academy in Rome arrived in The Hague. According to the Victoria and Albert Museum, by 1758, artists in London could see casts in the Duke of Richmond's gallery, allowing them to study foreign works from the comfort of England. By 1800, large collections had appeared, such as one at the Antique Hall in Mannheim, and cities all over Europe. The first plaster cast came to the American colonies in 1728, when artist John Smibert displayed some in his Boston studio. For the far-off Americans, plaster cast of art was the only practical way to obtain much in the way of art. George Washington assembled a plaster cast collection by way of an agent he sent to Europe. Initially, these collections were dedicated almost exclusively to classical or ancient works. This began to shift in the 19th century as interest in medieval and Renaissance artwork and architecture began to grow. For some works, such as architectural pieces or extremely large works, casts were the only way to effectively move the artwork from its original location so that those that lived far away could see them. The 19th century saw a growing movement to collect these casts for display and illustrate in museums national achievements. German antiquarian Hans von Offes gathered casts of medieval German architecture that would become the basis for the German National Museum in Nuremberg. Many of these collections would be lent to schools for educational purposes, artistic and historical. In England, beginning in 1841, the Government School of Design acquired a collection of casts of ornamental art of all periods and countries. In 1851, the Great Exhibition of the Works of All Nations, also known as the Crystal Palace Exhibition, took place at Hyde Park in London. Sir Henry Cole, a civil servant and inventor, was involved in planning for the Great Exhibition and became the first director of the Museum of Manufactures, which opened in 1852 with some exhibits purchased from the exhibition. By the mid-19th century, plaster casts were already seen as an integral part of a museum collection. The museum originally positioned itself as one serving practical needs, the improvement of public taste in design, and the application of fine art objects of utility, in contrast with the National Gallery and the British Museum. The museum promoted wide art education through museum collections. The museum initially held 1,550 cast examples from the School of Design and displayed on loan the cast collection of the Architectural Museum in 1857, when the museum moved to its present location in South Kensington. In 1861, the collection was reinforced by 3,200 plasters of architectural details that had been used as models for carvers in the construction of the Houses of Parliament in the 1830s. In fact, the collection would become part of a kind of pan-European movement. Henry Cole and John Charles Robinson began a systematic approach of what works should be collected and how they would house them. Unlike many other museums' cast collections, the collection at the South Kensington was envisioned as international in scope. The museum sought casts throughout Europe, trading casts with other museums or commissioning casts from European firms. This included the Pisa pulpits of Nicola and Giovanna Pisano, which were cast specifically for the museum, and castings of Trajan's Column. The work was collected in other ways as well. The cast of Michelangelo's David was actually sent to Queen Victoria as a peace offering from Grand Duke Ferdinand III of Tuscany, after he had prevented the export of a painting that the National Gallery was trying to acquire. It was sent to the museum in 1857. Robinson personally commissioned a cast of the Portico de la Gloria, or the Porch of Glory, of the Santiago de Compostela Cathedral on a visit to Spain in 1865. It was a difficult journey. The piece was enormous. Negotiations were delicate with church authorities, and the cast then had to travel by ship back to England. One thing we can learn from what items were collected during this period is what the historical taste of Victorian England was and how it changed. Along with classical casts, the casts that came from the School of Design represent works from the French and Italian Renaissance, especially ornamental details useful in education. Work in the initial period so favored architectural work and details that the collection came to be known as the architectural courts. This reflects in part the museum's aim to be of practical use for English craftsmen. By the 1860s, the collection had also turned to sculpture. Medieval and Renaissance pieces were most represented, though as the years went on, the Victoria and Albert Museum suggested that there was some shift of emphasis towards the Romanesque and Saracenic rather than Gothic. Other movements were less in demand. Mannerist and Baroque sculpture had only a few examples, such as Mercury and Psyche by Netherlandish sculptor Adrian de Vries. The collection also focused on foreign parts of Europe instead of English and Scottish works. There were some, such as a casting of the Grey Tomb from York Minster, the Prentice Pillar from the Rosslyn Chapel, and the Minstrel's Gallery from Exeter, but by far the collection was focused on collecting foreign works of interest. In 1864, the museum began a campaign to acquire Italian casts. This effort was led by Robinson, and the collection is now the most comprehensive collection of reproduced Italian Renaissance works outside of Italy. While the collection was growing, Cole saw that better than paying to have the cast made would be for museums and even nations to exchange castings of important works, with the hope of making the sum total, or at least a significant amount, of European artistic heritage available to all. By 1864, plans had been written up with the help of the Foreign Office to begin a system of exchanging copies of the finest works of art which each country possesses. It would take time to make the dream come to fruition, but Cole was equal to the task. After significant lobbying, Cole was able to present the fruit of his labor in 1867 at the Exposition Universelle in Paris. The exposition was a convenient place to argue for the value of a collection of casts, and it included a display of illustrations of the collection that had already been acquired at South Kensington. There he produced the International Convention for Promoting Universal Reproductions of Works of Art for the Benefit of Museums of All Countries. It is a forgotten but significant moment. A commitment from 15 different European leaders to share important works of art for the benefit of nations and their people. The convention acknowledged that every country possesses fine historical monuments of its own, which can easily be reproduced by casts, electrotypes, photographs, and other processes. It also declared that knowledge and appreciation of this art was necessary to continue advancing art globally. The system hope was for each country to form a commission for obtaining such reproductions as it may desire, and for the commissions to correspond in an effort to mitigate the costs. The convention was not necessarily binding, but reigning families from across Europe, including Albert, the Prince of Wales, Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, Frederick William, the Crown Prince of Prussia, Prince Jerome Napoleon, the Tsarevich Alexander, Humbert, the Prince Royal of Italy, Archduke Louis Charles of Austria, as well as princes, counts, or dukes of Hesse, Saxony, Belgium, Luxembourg, Sweden, Norway, Aosta, and Denmark. It was the beginning of a period of incredible cooperation, though not without its controversies. Making plaster casts was not entirely harmless and presented the threat of damage to national and cultural treasures. Some complained that casting altered sculptural color. Throughout the 19th century, the collection at South Kensington grew, adding works like the St. Sabalish Shrine and Schreier Monument from Germany, the singing galleries of Lucia de Robbia and Donatello, and Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise. Acquisition reached its height in the 1870s. The need for space to display the influx led to the creation of the architectural courts, designed by Henry Scott of the Royal Engineers. Plans were made in 1870, and by 1871 the courts had a roof, and work on the interior began. In his diary, Cole noted the opening of the courts laconically. New architectural court opening in evening. Generally, much approved. Others had more to say. The Building News said, "The new court is indeed a novelty of construction, and it may safely be said that the world does not possess such another." The West Court may have been built specifically to display two of the largest casts. Trajan's Column, split into two huge casts built around chimney-like structures, and the enormous Portico de la Gloria. The Art Journal criticized the inclusion of Trajan's Column, which they said has the effect of crowding out the sight of those casts of more sensible proportions. The Times in 1882 wrote of the most extraordinary jumble of works in the collection. At the beginning, the courts did not only include casts, but were interspaced with originals. They provide a unique experience. In 1882, Monsieur Daniel Conway records Professor Omnium saying, "Come, let us take an excursion round the world," before visiting the courts. While the collection itself, Kensington, it was officially renamed the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1899, continued to grow. By 1873, the most impressive castworks had largely been gathered, with the possible exception of 4,000 pieces transferred from the Architectural Museum in 1916. The museum also hoped to collect cast pieces that were on display at the Crystal Palace. In the 1920s, some works from the V&A Museum were almost transferred to the Crystal Palace instead, but fortunately none were moved before the palace was destroyed in a fire in 1936. The casts that survived the fire, 23 of them, were instead moved to the Victoria and Albert. In the 20th century, there was a reaction against plaster casts of originals, and some of this was due to the growing ease of travel and perhaps the growing ubiquity of photographs and reproductions. Another reason may have been the growing trade in antiquities, allowing many museums to hold more originals. Museums holding plaster casts of originals came to be seen as pointless, the reproductions themselves fakes, unworthy of display. Wilhelm von Bode, a director of the Berlin museums, argued that even a fragment of an original was more valuable than a plaster cast of a masterpiece. Around the world, collections declined. They were put into storage, where they were often damaged or lost. Even their use in art schools fell out of favor. In some ways, the 20th century also showed the possible value of these fakes. War, time, and vandalism has led to the loss of a considerable amount of artwork. The Victoria and Albert holds a cast of a 15th century relief from Lübeck, Germany, of Christ washing the apostles' feet. The original was destroyed during the Second World War. At Cornell University, a bust of Roman Emperor Trajan is one of the only surviving copies of a lost original. Greek bronzes of antiquity were lost in large numbers as the metal was melted down, but Roman copies have preserved invaluable works of the ancient past. Others preserve details that have been lost to the ravages of time, erosion, and pollution. English explorer Alfred Maudsley took hundreds of molds of Central American and Mexican sculpture in the late 19th century, preserving works that have been damaged by time and humans. It is only recently that appreciation for the casts, both as examples of artwork they copy and for their part in history, have had a resurgence in appreciation. Today, plaster casts of countless works of art that were cast during the 19th century can still be viewed in museums around the world, like the Victoria and Albert Museum and at universities like Cornell or Cambridge University. They offer a unique framework to look at the history, not only because they preserve literally ancient works of art, but because they also represent the unique period in which the plaster casts were created. Heck, the casts are old enough now to be considered artifacts themselves. We also live in a world where preservation techniques have reached incredible heights that never could have been even imagined in the 19th century. Digital preservation can copy even minute details, but we also still live in a world where conflict and nature and destruction are commonplace. Enough so that we almost daily lose permanently important pieces of our human heritage. And in light of that, maybe we can consider that the loftier ideals of the Victorian plaster casts used for both education and preservation deserve to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.